In 1920, missionaries in India found two girls living inside a wolf den, moving on all fours, eating raw meat, and flinching at human touch like wild animals. They named them Amala and Kamala. Within a year, one of them was dead. Cases like this have been documented for centuries. Children found living with wolves, dogs, monkeys, even goats, isolated from human contact during their earliest years. They're often called feral children, and what happened to their minds afterward turned out to reveal something researchers hadn't fully understood about how the human brain develops. Kamala, the surviving girl, was studied for years by an orphanage director named J.A.L. Singh, who kept detailed records of her recovery. She initially walked on all fours, ate only raw meat, and flinched away from human hands like a cornered animal. Over roughly 9 years, she learned to walk upright and picked up around 50 words, but she never developed language anywhere close to a typical child her age, despite years of patient teaching. Researchers showed her flashcards, practiced simple phrases with her, celebrated every small step. Physically, she adapted fast. She outperformed other children her age on basic survival tasks. But language stayed just out of reach, no matter how much instruction she received. This pattern shows up again and again in documented feral child cases, and it lines up with something researchers call a critical period for language acquisition, a developmental window, roughly from infancy through puberty, when the brain is uniquely wired to absorb language through exposure. Miss that window entirely, and the brain's language processing regions don't just develop more slowly later. Some research suggests they may never fully develop the same capacity at all. One of the most closely studied modern cases involves a girl discovered in 1,970 inches, the United States, who had spent most of her childhood in near total isolation, deprived of nearly all social interaction and language exposure. When she was found around age 13, right at the edge of that critical window, researchers had an unprecedented chance to study what happens when intensive rehabilitation starts that late. Despite years of dedicated work by linguists and psychologists, she learned vocabulary and basic phrases, but never developed grammar the way children exposed to language from infancy do. Her speech remained fundamentally different in structure, no matter how much progress she made elsewhere. The reason traces back to how the brain physically organizes itself early in life. In infancy, the brain produces an enormous surplus of neural connections, far more than it will ultimately keep. Picture a baby's brain as an overgrown network, wildly overconnected in every direction. Which connections survive and which get pruned away depends almost entirely on stimulation, language, social interaction, even basic environmental exposure. The pathways that get used get reinforced. The ones that don't get quietly cut away, almost like a gardener trimming back branches that never bore fruit. Without exposure, foundational pathways for language and complex social behavior weaken or fail to form as strongly. And once that early pruning window closes, later experience can't fully rebuild what wasn't reinforced the first time. Not every documented case shows identical patterns. Researchers have spent decades debating exactly how severe or permanent these effects are, poring over old journals, faded photographs, and inconsistent historical records. Since many older cases lack the kind of rigorous documentation modern science would require, and some children may have had pre-existing developmental differences before their isolation even began. But across the more carefully studied cases, one theme holds up consistently. The earlier and more complete the isolation, and the older the child before rehabilitation begins, the more persistent the language and social gaps tend to be. There's also a striking pattern in how these children adapted to their non-human environments. Several documented cases describe children physically mimicking the animals they lived among, moving with a wolf's crouched gait, developing heightened smell or hearing, forming genuine social bonds, and even protective instincts toward the animals that had effectively raised them. A child running alongside a wolf pack through tall grass, sleeping curled inside a den while the pack formed a loose circle around them, climbing trees fluidly alongside monkeys. Their brains weren't failing to develop socially, they were developing completely functional social understanding, just calibrated to an entirely different species than the one they'd eventually have to rejoin. This connects to a bigger idea researchers take seriously today. The human brain isn't simply born knowing how to be human, it's born